All right. Well, we've got a smaller group than anticipated here at home because of the storms, but hopefully everybody's able to join, and I am taping so that we can send the tape out so that everybody can stay caught up. We are in the process of trying to get all of the Song of Solomon classes up on the A Shared Inheritance site. So for those of you who use that resource, hopefully you'll be able to do those Song of Solomon classes too. A couple of you have asked me about those, one or two that you were missing. So those should be out there soon. We're making some changes to A Shared Inheritance, and so hopefully that'll continue to be a good resource if you're finding it to be useful for yourselves. So we talked last week about the book itself, the book of Job itself, how it's written, why it's considered a book of poetry, some of the issues that it finds itself addressing, and of course why we study it. We talked about the fact that it is probably the most written about and studied book in the scriptures, certainly one of the most. And of course, it's because all of us find ourselves at a particular time in our lives where things are happening to us beyond our control, where we have not caused the circumstances necessarily, and we have to grapple with the way that God deals with his creation in the world. So tonight, our lesson, we're going to take a look at the man, Job, who he was, the few things that we're told about him through scripture, and sort of try to get it in our minds. When I study the Bible, I love to actually put a name with a face. So I make a face up in my head, obviously, but I like to find the people real, because then it makes the experiences that they have real for us. This was a man. He wasn't a man with a special gene. He didn't have some sort of special perseverance gene in his body that allowed him to deal with God fairly. He was frustrated. He pushed the limits at times. He could not figure out why things were happening to him in his life the way that they had. And so if we make him real to ourselves, then our experiences become more reflected in his own life as well. And I think that that's important for us to do always with Bible study. And so we start with the first chapter of the book of Job, and we're told that there was a man. He wasn't an extraordinary man. He wasn't a saint by the definition of sainthood. He did not have miraculous powers. He was a man. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And so it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of all of them. For Job said, "It may be that one of my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. And so in these few 5 verses and these few words, we are given a description of a man. And though we don't, certainly we by no means know Job, completely and in detail. We are given the essence of who this man is and what his life was like. When we meet him at the beginning, and we know this because we understand the entire book as an overview of the entire book, that this man Job, who we read about in these verses, was certainly not of the understanding that he is at the end of the of the experiences that he has. We talked last week about the fact that we have no idea how long Job experiences the conversations and the sorting through and the consideration and the meditation on everything that was happening to him. We have no idea how long it took for God to come, whether it was months or years or weeks or days, or we have no idea, decades. We don't know that. But we know that after one affliction and the next affliction and the next affliction and the next affliction, and the meditation and the consideration and the longing for God, that Job became a different man than what we see here. That he was impacted, and that he was changed. But it's interesting that he was not changed by anything outward. You know, I was thinking today about the fact that a lot of times people say, well, yeah, but, you know, after he lost all these kids and he lost everything, but at the end, you know, he was blessed and he had even more. Well, you don't undo losing your children. You know, you don't undo all of the experiences that he had, all of the betrayal of those around him. You don't undo the things that have happened to you. That one of the things that I find interesting about the book of Job now in my later life is understanding that God anticipated and expected Job to find joy again, even with the afflictions that had come upon him. And that's a real different thing, you know, that there is a maturity about Job through his afflictions that comes. And so we do understand here, though, that he was a man who belonged to God. He considers God. He abides in God. Even when the way was very unclear and he was not really sure what was happening and what everything meant, he had a faith that sustained him. So the faith of sustainment is what we see in the very beginning of the first chapter of Job. That's who he was. He was a man who had a faith that could sustain him as he learned and as he was sifted and as he was tried and as he was tested the way that he will be. God describes him as his servant. There's an ownership there. He was God's servant, which by definition expresses submission, right? Recognition. It indicates that there was a debt to another, that he was a servant, that Job felt he owed a debt to God, one who does the will of the master. And so that is who Job was. I think it's who we are, that we have a master. We feel that we have a debt we could never pay, that God would consider as his servants. He dwells in us. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. I'm going to pass that by right now. This is sort of in order. He was perfect and upright. In a sense, it is said in the scriptures that he was blameless. He had a blameless heart. He lived by the rules of divine law. He was verified by God's judgment, not his own, that God finds us righteous. Are we righteous in and of ourselves? Absolutely not. But can we be found righteous? We must. And so that is who Job was. We must be found righteous by the judgment of God. He was blameless, not perfect, but no blame could be given when one examined his decisions, when one examined his behavior. He was blameless among men. It's one of the qualifications of our elders. Does that mean our elders are perfect people? Absolutely not. Does it mean if our elders were dragged into court, could they be found guilty of breaking the law of Christ on a regular basis, or would they be considered rebels? Do they live walking upright and blameless before God? That's who he was. We read here and we see that he was a man of sincere worship. He was upright and pure because he considered the will of the Lord before he considered his own will. We are shown that. And we have to be careful how we proceed, even when we worship. And, I've had a lot of conversations through the years with younger people who will say, well, worship is all the time. It's not just on Sunday. Well, it's a lot of things. Worship is a lot of things. We come together for congregational worship. We must be very careful what we do and how we worship. We must worship in the manner that God would have us worship. It looks like Job was considered that. He was blameless among those things, also blameless in his own behavior. There are waves of movements in every generation. I think each generation has the inclination to question and reconsider traditions. I think that's something we do. I think children always do that. Well, why do we do things like that? You'll find out as you raise your children, they ask a lot of why questions. Mom, why do you do that? Why do you do that? Well, why do you do that? I've often told the story about when we were talking about traditions that we do in our worship services. Why do you partake of the Lord's Supper the way you do? And why do we do certain things? And we need to know those things so that we can answer for ourselves with a good conscience and with a blameless disposition towards God. But there was a story about a woman who she was known for baking the best hams. And her mother had taught her and her grandmother had taught her, and she just always was the one that made the best hams. And so her daughter was watching her so that she could learn. And the woman would get the ham and she'd cut off both ends of the ham and she'd put it in the pan and she'd stick it in the oven and she'd do certain things and she'd pull it out and it would just be the best. And so the daughter one day was asking her, well, why do you do this? And why do you do that? And why do you cut the ends off? And she said, that's just the way you do it. That's what makes it so good. Well, of course, it ended up that it was because the oven was too small. And so, you had to cut the ham but we do get asked questions and we do need to be able to answer ourselves. I think Job knew why he did what he did religiously, why he was who he was. I think that was part of his blamelessness, that he was concerned. And it's not bad to question, but we don't need to think of a new way to approach worship. It seems that Job followed the traditions of his forefathers. And so we have to watch for hearts that are rebellious in spirit, that we not question because of the kinds of servants that we are, that we're not servants who are considering our wants rather than our master's wants, that we're listening to the master's instructions. And we are not doing what God would have us to do while we're computing a different way to do everything. So attitudes of challenging the old thinking are not always bad, and we're going to discuss that as we go through Job. Actually, the middle conversation is actually somebody who had observed life a lot, and he had observed things, and that's not always bad. However, many times those rethinking everything is out of it means that there's no fear for God, but rather an arrogant selfishness about ourselves. And it'll leave us unacceptable. And it possibly will be tossed to and fro when we're confronted with different circumstances considering worship. I mean, there are just a lot of people that want to please themselves when it comes to worshiping God, that they'll leave and say, well, that just was not entertaining. That preacher just he's not a good speaker. Or that really, I mean, they just don't have good singers, or that this or that. And we are not, our worship to be blameless and upright is about God's instructions to us on who it is that we are and what it is that we should be and what our relationship with him is. And so we need to be careful of that. Job feared his maker, and he walked according to his ways. He had a reverence for his majesty, a regard for his authority, and he avoided all appearances of sin or anything approaching it. Terry and I talk a lot in the day, and we've been reading Psalms 119 together, and we were talking yesterday, and I said, I'm telling you, I promise you, I can 100% tell you this is no lie. I will not be arrested at 2:00 in the morning in downtown Jacksonville. I won't. I really will not. I will not be found with disorderly conduct due to being drunk it's just not going to happen. And the reason why is because I'm not there. And so when people assume that something's happened to them and, oh, I've been caught, they're not walking blameless. They could be blamed for something. And of course, the consequences of that. And he didn't walk a fine line spiritually. He just wasn't looking for those minimums. He was blameless and upright. Those are very determined verbs. No, verbs, I guess, adjectives. But I don't have my English teacher here to correct me, so I'm okay. They're adjectives, they're descriptive, but they're also verbs. Well, if you're upright, if you're walking, well, I guess it's an adjective. Yeah, you're right. Okay, walking's a verb. All right, ladies, they're adjectives. Okay, so he was not constantly reconsidering his service. He was not rethinking his religion every day. He wasn't getting up every morning and saying, oh, what am I going to do today? Should I worship God? Should I do this? Should I do that? It was part of him. It was his core. It defined him and who he was. He was moving forward, not always asking difficult questions. Not one constantly, searching for something new. And that's really the description of him, that he was perfect and upright. He was blameless. He was righteous. That's who he was. He didn't question every day. He didn't think about everything as in, well, God, is this okay? Or is this okay? Or is this okay? That's just who he was. And I will tell you, that makes a big difference in your life if you can get that right. That this is who I am. And I know who I am. And I'm not rethinking this every day. And I'm not reconsidering God every day. That I know who he is. And in relation to that, I understand who I am. I am his servant. That is what makes us upright and blameless. And there is a big difference when we're wavering around and we're tossed to and fro and we're listening to other people and we're thinking about, well, does this really satisfy me? It doesn't matter if it satisfies you. It makes no difference. If we're singing with our voices praise to our Lord from our hearts, it doesn't matter whether or not the sounds are pleasing on an earthly way. He was prosperous and he was respected in this world. God had blessed him. He was blessed. And this is why Satan's questions justified. That's what we talked about last week. What Satan didn't understand about this man in general was that people who have this type of sincerity and this type of fear for the Lord, and they are blameless and upright, are not about what they have or don't have, but about who they are and who God is. And that's a very different consideration. Satan's question was a good question. Well, why wouldn't Job do everything that you think he ought to do? I mean, look at, you've got him hedged in. He is completely protected. There is no reason for him to go astray. Why would he? Everything's comfortable. All of his family admires him for that. The most comfortable thing for him to do is to get up and worship you, and things just go well, and he's prosperous, and everything's working out great. Why would he not? And that's a wonderful question that Satan asked God. And I will tell you, it is a question that my guess is most people would not be able to react in the way that Job reacted to it. Most people would say, wait a minute, has God left me? And what's happening? And this can't be a God and creator of all things if he doesn't want the very best for all of us. And actually, our relationship to God has nothing to do with our possessions or our circumstances, by the way. Absolutely nothing to do with that. Even harder for us to understand and easier for us to forget is that our relationship with God actually has nothing to do with our relationships in life. It has nothing to do with our husbands, with our fathers, with our mothers, with our brothers and sisters in Christ even. That who Job was, being perfect and upright and blameless, had nothing to do with what he had or didn't have, or anybody he was related to, or any of the men that honored him. It had to do with God and him. And of course, that is what allowed him then to face the trials and the tribulations. So we see that he had great comfort in his children. And that's a wonderful thing. These children were evidently grown. They had houses of their own. I think nothing should make people happier than their kids not being in their basement. And so I know that makes me happy. I like that. And life was pleasant. It was good. His children were responsible for themselves. They were able to support their own families. They had their houses. They celebrated events together. They would come to each other's homes to celebrate birthdays, and they enjoyed being around each other. Job and his wife, it appears, had reached a time in their life when there were no more diapers to change and no more baths to give, no more spankings and correction, no more lunches to prepare, carpools to drive, no boys hanging around waiting on daughters, no teenage daughters analyzing the herdsman and everything that they had said that day. None of that. Their children were settled, and it was a wonderful time. It appears to be a very rich time in Job's life. His grown children, like I said, appear to be responsible. And I just don't know anything better for parents in their earthly lives than to be able to be confident that their children are okay without them. You know, I think we tend to, in our culture, and in many cultures actually, have grown children who are dependent, but it does not appear that Job did have that. His children tended to seem to be leaders of their own family, and at the same time, it is interesting his spiritual concern for these grown children. That his concern for his children was no longer about their needs, their earthly needs. He didn't have to feed them anymore. Didn't have to house them anymore. Didn't have to clothe them anymore. Wasn't worried about who they were going to marry. It appears they were married and settled. His greatest concern for his children, and even before actually the fun and celebrations, it seems, was spiritual in nature. In verse 5, he would send for them that he might sanctify them. I think that's an interesting thing. This is certainly, I believe, and we talked about this last week in our introduction, I think he lived in a patriarchal age. He lived in the time when fathers were the patriarchs of the family. They were the priests. I believe that that is true. I think they offered the sacrifices for their family. There's no question that we read that. And in verse 5, he would send for them that he might sanctify them, that he might set them apart, that he might make them different. His concern was not that he could give them more flocks. He didn't bring them in to give them more money, to make sure everybody had more things. He didn't seem to bring them in to make sure that they had done everything they needed to do to be respected, such as education or whatever it was. He brought them up. He would rise early in the morning, first things first, and he would sanctify them, set them apart, offer burnt offerings, raise petitions for them, according to the number of all of them, each according to what was needed and differently for each. And I think that's an interesting thing for parents to think about. That as we're raising our children, and even as they're older, I have 2 grown children now, run very different households. They're both godly households. They're both teaching their children about God. They're both faithful to the Lord, but my prayers and my petitions for both are different. They have different personalities, different types of households. And I think that's what's being discussed here, that Job knew his children. He knew what they needed. He knew their weaknesses. Actually, him sanctifying them shows that Job knew, he understood that his children could be in jeopardy of losing their relationship with God, that they must set themselves apart, that he could help set them apart, that through his understanding of God, he could enable them to understand God. He prayed, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed or not been obedient to God in their hearts." And he lifted up petitions for them for their shortcomings. His concerns was that they know God, that they would obey God. And I think it was his time to find out how things were going. He taught his children who he was in these demonstrations. You know, my father used to always say that really losing your children can sometimes be about the fact that they see who you really are, that they understand you're not sincere, that they understand this is not really real to you, that your children will see whether or not you really believe. And can you imagine Job, who was rising up early and bringing his children in, I think one by one at a time. I don't think he necessarily did an offering for every one of them every day, but when there was a need, perhaps, when there was a particular prayer that was needed, when there was a circumstance that arose in one of their lives where they needed him, perhaps he spent more time sanctifying them during that time. And he showed them what real undefiled religion looked like. That I'm serious about this. And you can go and believe whatever you want to believe. You know, finally, you have to let your children go and say, you're going to believe it or not believe it. And we've talked about this, you have to be converted for yourself. I think all children are converted. And I think many who are raised in the churches of our Lord's kingdom are not converted sometimes until they're 25, 30, 35 years old, that finally it dawns on them. Oh, wait, Mom, Dad, what's going on? I have to think about this. I have to do this. You mean this means something to me? You mean this is going to hold my life together? You mean when this tragedy has come, I'm going to have to believe this now? And so that is what I think he was doing. With grown children, he was doing this. Grown children who were going to face life's tragedies and life circumstances that he couldn't control. And he sanctified, and he continued to do this with his children. And he taught them. He made them a peculiar people. He taught them how to worship and how to cling to God in even the worst circumstances. And that's the ones that are going to die. Those are the ones he's going to lose. And we must bring our children to the Lord over and over again. Pray every day for your children. Pray for stability, for them to withstand trials and tribulations that they may face and be facing. I actually have prayed that I die before my children face a tragedy that I feel they may not be able to bear. Pray that they marry in the Lord, that they have tender and repenting hearts, that they obey and see truth. Pray that they remain faithful no matter where life takes them. And I'll tell you something else Job did. He didn't live in this unrealistic world about his children. I mean, had he done that, he would have never brought them into sanctifying. Had he thought his kids were perfect, or had he made excuses for them, well, I know, but old Rover, he married so-and-so, and that's just going to be, that's going to be a problem for him. It didn't seem that he made excuses for them. He didn't say that they were too smart. I've known Christian people that I think thought their children were too smart to be part of the kingdom. Didn't think they were too good. He didn't think they were not good enough. He understood that his children would need to rely on God as well. And we mustn't make excuses for our children. We pray that they remain faithful no matter where life takes them. And at times we pray that they return to the Lord, even if through calamity, that is what has to happen. That even through calamity, Amika, you know that. Yeah. That if that's what has to happen, it's okay. We have a very dear friend who lost a child at 30. And I had spent hours with her crying and praying and saying I would do anything to bring him back. I would do anything to bring him back. And he got sick. And he died. But before he died, he came back. You know who I'm talking about. And I said to her, this is your prayer answered. Because if it takes death, physical death, for your child to have spiritual life, it is okay. It is okay. And I think Job knew that. What do we desire for our children? We must lead them spiritually. We must show them. And so that's what he was in an earthly definition. In 5 verses, that's who he was. I'm going to briefly talk about Uz. There are lots written about where he was from. There's no question he was from the east. We're told he was from the east, and it would have been the east of a population that lived in a certain area. It could be further east than these two places. These are the ones thought. I tend to think Saudi Arabia more. Arabia would have been an eastern. I think the Magi that came when Jesus was born came from probably Arabia, those areas of the east there, which would have been considered that. It may have originally been named after Uz, who was the son of Abram, the grandson of Shem. So early on in the chronological order, in the genealogies, one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, came from Teman, Job 4:1, which is in Edomiah. It could be, Edomiah, which is Edom. And it could be that he was from there. It could be that he and Eliphaz were from the same place. And that could very well be. It seems that Eliphaz, certainly Job's friends knew him well. They were good friends of his. And so that makes us think Uz was the subject of attacks to attacks from the Chaldeans and the Sabeans, and we know that the Chaldeans are mentioned in Job as being those who come in. It had to have had fertile pastures wherever he was from, because look at his livestock. There's no way. I mean, he had to have been from a place that would sustain his livestock, which he had a lot of, thousands of animals. And it had to at least have had some major city where he was from, because he sat at the gates. And at the gates of the city, if there were elders, there would have been at least 10 of them. And so there would have been some sort of city affiliated with Job. He seemed to have honor among those who were of the population that surrounded him. The two most likely locations I've circled here, I think it doesn't really matter, but either east of Petra today or in Bashan, which is that northern kingdom. It's where the prophecies of the women that were spoiled, they were from that area up, which is now the Golan Heights. For those of you who have been to Israel, you'll get to see that when you guys go. The Golan Heights, over near where the man with the legion of demons was, a little bit north of there. But anyway, it doesn't really matter, but I think it's an interesting thing. And a lot of people want to know that when they read Job. Where was he from? And certainly, I believe he was from east of the Jordan, probably. So anyway, doesn't really matter. And I wouldn't fall on my sword, and I wouldn't even argue. In fact, I wouldn't pay any attention at all if you wanted to say that it was something else. All right. So, but that's the way that goes. All right. So we'll just take it from here then. Okay. So that's who Job was. It's a good guy. The guy we would have liked. A guy we know probably, right? We know some of those guys. That's who he was. Just a man. Lived at a certain time. Not the year that we did, not the place that we do, but just like us. And just like every other faithful person that has lived throughout the years. All right. So let's read. I'm going to read the two passages of the heavenly encounters together. So that's Job 1, 6 through 12, and then again in Job 2, verses 1 through 3. So in Job 1, 6 through 12, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Well, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Well, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You bless the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And then we're going to read 2, 1 through 6. And again, and we'll put these together, but these are the two conversations. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come? From where do you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." So Satan answered and said to the Lord, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." It's interesting, this. Now there was a day. So we started with, now there's a man. There's a man. He's just going about his life, going to bed at night, getting up in the day, doing his stuff, worshiping God, seeing his kids, taking care of, I'm sure, little situations, sitting at the gates, judging people. That would be a disastrous job. And just, doing what you do. And now there's a day. There's a day in heaven. A new scene opens up. This is one of those passages that we can't get out of our minds, kind of, that, I find myself riding in the car and I just look up and think, what is going on up there? In the third heavens, as the Jews would say, way up there. What in the world is going on? You think of Elisha and Elijah and everything they saw, and of Ezekiel and Isaiah, and you just think, what in the world is going on up there? And then you read a passage like this where people are just, and it's hard to imagine. And we find ourselves looking up and thinking about, what is possibly going on? We can't even begin to imagine what might be going on. And remember, like I said, we left Job behind just taking care of business, not bothering anybody or causing any problems, probably making a few plans for the next day, plans that were going to be sharply interrupted due to this conversation that Job would know nothing about. Or maybe Job slept while God had this conversation with Satan. Maybe Job was just sound asleep, just as secure as can be in the Lord, as God carries out this plan with Satan that would amaze and shock us and him. He's going to permit things to get underway that we and Job would never expect. Without Job's knowledge, something that will affect him in every aspect of his life here on earth is happening in the heavens. When things happen to us, we have to believe that God has heard our prayers. We have to believe. Otherwise, we have no way to have peace. You have to know it. There's just no way to settle our minds if we don't believe. And without Job's knowledge, something was going to happen that was contingent on this conversation. Decisions that will blow his earthly world to bits are being made. Decisions that he may never even know about. It seems that when God appears, if we have everything God said, God does not address this day in heaven with Job. And so you think about that. There was a man on earth, and at the same time, there was a day in heaven. And so we're lifted in a single verse from earth's familiar settings, just a guy doing his family, kind of just doing things, to this unfamiliar scene of God in his presence. And so, we're going to look at Satan. It's the weirdest thing. I think this verse may stretch us a little bit, just as much as some of the other verses that take us into the heavens. But there's one being who seems very comfortable among the sons of God. He seems very comfortable. The seraphim, the ever-present attendants of God, are there. I mean, they're just there. They're there in the presence of God. Our God, most powerful, looks out on these angelic servants who have come to present themselves before him, which is an interesting thing. And they are, after all, going to be accountable to him. They're accountable to him, and he sees an intruder. And perhaps the sons of God don't recognize him. I mean, they're not. You would think if they did, there'd be a little flurry or something. There'd be a little, I don't know. We don't know. It seems that God's the one that recognizes him. He's walking among them. And the Hebrew here calls him the Satan. The Satan was among them. He may have disguised himself as one of them. He is indeed most attractive. He is brilliant. He is powerful. He's attractive to people we know in the world. He's attractive to me at times, right? I mean, are we not, how do we kid ourselves? I mean, we just studied Song of Solomon, and the king certainly thought that he could offer the world, and that the Shulamite girl would be interested in that. I mean, that's what the world is. It's attractive. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's very addictive. I mean, this is an incredible scene. Perhaps the Son of God and the heavenly things themselves didn't recognize this one who was engaged in a relentless commitment to destroy God's people. I mean, that's where he had been. When God asked him, where have you been? He said, oh, I've been trying to go down there and destroy your creation. That's what he says. That's what I've been doing. I've been busy. That's what he tells God. And so here then, we are witnesses of this most interesting dialogue. Where did you come from? You ever think about who's talking? You ever think about that? You think God didn't know where Satan had been? You ever know something about your children but you ask them so that you can hear them actually say those words? You ever say, yeah, where have you been tonight, Will? See what he comes back with. Russ tells a story when they lived in Kansas. They just lived. I mean, his dad was a chemical engineer, and they were at a helium factory. Anyway, it was just flat wheat fields everywhere, and those boys would just play everywhere. But there was a fence at a certain point. And Mackie said it was a long way from their house, and they were not allowed to go over that fence. And the fence it was wooden, and it had red paint on it. And so the boys were really tempted. Russ said there was a really neat wheat field just over that fence, And he said the fence was so far away from the house, you couldn't see it. And so they'd be out playing all day, and they'd climb over that fence, and they'd come back in, and their mom would say, where you boys been? They'd say, oh, we've just been playing in the wheat fields. And did y'all go over the red fence? And he said his mom always knew. She always knew when they had been over the fence, and they could not figure it out. And she told them later that it put red on their shoes. And so she'd just look at the bottom of their shoes, and she knew they had been over the fence, He said he always thought his mom had like magical powers or something, but you ask because you want them to tell you something that you already know. When your children come in and they're after curfew, and you already have a feeling that you know where they are, you ask them, because we need to get in our minds that it is important for us to be able to give accountability for ourselves. Us praying to God for the forgiveness of our sins, we need to state our sins to God. It makes it real. I'll tell you, God, what I've done today that I do not like myself for, and you must hate, because I know it's a sin. And so God asks us to examine ourselves so that we can get that in our heads, what it is that we've done. We ask our children to explain themselves because there may not be an explanation. I remember one time Will and his friends had really gotten into trouble. And he came home in the middle of the night. He was brought home, and we said, we'll talk to you in the morning. And the next morning, we sat him down and we said, what were you thinking? I can't even imagine. I mean, I knew his IQ was just high enough that surely he knew better than this, And I said, what were you thinking? And he sat a long time, and he said, I said, I'm not sure, but I don't think we were thinking anything. Okay, well, that's probably true. But you want them to verbalize so that they see and they know. And I think that's what, God wants Satan to account for himself. You tell me that you've been out there looking for my people to destroy them. You talk about an enemy. I want you to tell me. And of course, God, being all powerful, already knew. So God says, tell me what you've been doing. You account for yourself. God then prompts Satan to direct his attention to Job. It seems to actually anger Satan. And it prompts this legitimate question of Satan's, which we discussed earlier. You think Job obeys you just because you're so wonderful and because you're owed all this respect and this honor? You think I don't have power enough to get to Job? You think you own him enough and he is your servant enough that he won't betray you and come to me? That's what Satan's saying. That's what Satan wants of us. He wants to be able to tell God, I told you I could get Liz. I knew I could. If it just got bad enough, I could get her. A question that Satan's intellect and intelligent reasoning powers have rightfully addressed. If it's bad enough, I'll get him. And in his anger at Job's situation, and in this ridiculous threat of Satan, he will challenge God, in a sense, to allow him to harm, to bring a trial, a tribulation, afflict Job. Let me afflict him. I'll start with his relationships. I'll start with his possessions. And that should get him. Satan is challenging God. I think this is mind-boggling. I think about this. Moses couldn't look at God. Daniel was stricken and fainted in God's presence. Job, when God appears in a whirlwind, will slap his hand over his mouth. But Satan stood and looked at him and threatened him. That is our adversary. That is our battle. That is who we are fighting. That is who is after us. That is who is after Job. That is the strength of the enemy. And it is a good question. He's made the assumption, not a bad one, that men and women worship God because of what they get out of it. I will tell you that is the evangelical message of Christianity in our society today. You just pray and send in your offering and good things are going to happen to you. Do you know that is never a promise of God? In fact, bad things may happen to you. That is not the promise God gives. What God desires of us is that we become spiritual dependents on him, spiritually dependent upon him, not physically dependent upon him. God never promises to change our state in life. He never told slaves they would be free. He never told the poor they would be rich. He never told the ugly people they'd be beautiful. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be great? Then everybody would want to be a member, right? He didn't tell the old people they'd be young. He didn't say if you wrecked your life to the woman in the temple who was brought to him for adultery. He never said, go back and don't worry, everything will be fine. Nobody will remember anything. He said, go and sin no more. And she went back to try to reinvent herself in a synagogue where everybody knew she had been drugged before the Sanhedrin in the temple. And he didn't mend all of that. He doesn't change us in those ways. That is the evangelical message. And that's what Satan says. It's not a bad assumption to make. It's what our gospel message many times on the airways is. There are many who lose their faith at the first sight of life is not fair. Life doesn't seem fair. God's not listening to me. This is not working out for me. I don't like the situation I'm in. I thought I'd be married by now. I thought I'd have children by now. What's the deal? I can't have children. I don't like this. I've lost a child. I've lost my home. I've lost everything. You know, the stock market has crashed and all I know to do is kill myself. I don't know. I think that happened. I don't really know that part of history. That's not that interesting to me. But anyway, you know, life's not fair. It isn't fair. And like we've said many times in this class, we are among the most blessed of that end of that spectrum. You just go to India and you'll find out how very unfair life is, not to you. And that's why we're given the parable of the sower, because life's struggles and defeats can choke out a faith and desire to serve. That unbelief can set in due to misfortunes and disappointments. That's what he told the 12 apostles. You're going to be sifted. You're going to have to figure this out. Eventually, he told Peter, you're going to lose your life. Lee did a lesson in India about, saying, and then he looks at John and he says, what about that? What about him? What happens to him? That's what he says, right? Yeah. And Jesus says, who cares? What if I let him live until I come back again? I don't know what Peter thought about that. Peter might have thought, well, that doesn't seem fair, right? I mean, our circumstances don't get to, God allows Satan to wound that the Lord may heal. He's going to bring Job low so that the Lord can lift him up. Humble that the Lord might exalt. Disturb his nest so that the Lord could fill it. He's going to empty his nest. He will allow afflictions to come so that Job can cling more deeply to God by faith and not by sight. He's not going to, Job's going to sit in that ash pit and no longer have the joys of his children and their houses and the sacrifices that he's offered every day. He's no longer going to have those relationships. He's no longer going to have a house. He's no longer going to have his livestock. He will have to have confidence through belief and not instant manifestation of promises. That's where the Israelites gave up. Later we're told in Hebrews that it was a heart of unbelief, that they just simply did not believe the promises well enough. That when they were in the wilderness, they just said, I don't see it. Everything's dusty. I have to tell you, we went down there and I did tell Russ, I said, I am ashamed to tell you, I would complain about this dust. It would be a disaster to try to clean your house. And I am a little picky about that. It would be hard. And so God's confident, but I don't believe God's sure. This is another thing about Job when you read, I don't think God knew what Job would do, actually. I think God lets everybody be tested. And I don't think that God necessarily knew what Job would do. There's no indication of that in his conversation with Job. He points Job out. With Satan. He points Job out and he says, have you considered him? He is upright. He is righteous. And maybe God had some confidence in him, but boy, I'm telling you, he lets him afflict him. And he doesn't answer him right away. And Job gets pretty close to telling God what to do. I don't know. Like I said, neither conversation said that God told Satan, Job will not sin. He doesn't say that. He says, why don't you test him? Because he's blameless and upright. You ever think about that? I don't think he knew. I don't think there's an indication of that. And I think through all the conversation, God just listened and watched. He points out Job's blameless righteousness, but he too is watching. He watches that ring as those two opponents face off with each other. You ever think about God watching you battle Satan? Just tell Satan, get away from me. I sometimes will just tell him, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. Get away. Leave me. Get away. I'm not doing it. Like my little granddaughter, Emmy. XX. Everything she didn't like. Granny, XX to that. XX. Tell him. You're in a ring with him. Now, let me tell you, I don't know how to box. And if I don't rely on God, I'm not going to make it. He is our opponent. And I just picture God watching from the heavens as all this is happening to Job, who, by the way, he is recommended to Satan. What will his people do with Satan? He's watching. Sometimes he's silent. You ever prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed? And a year later, you're still praying and you're praying and you're praying for a situation to rectify, for something to happen, for you to know, please tell me, what should I say? What should I do? He provides answers, or he doesn't. Sometimes he doesn't. He allows his people, all of his people, to struggle in affliction with tools that he has provided to fight. He doesn't pity. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't send angels. Why would he if he didn't to Jesus on the cross? He just watches. He watches us. And that's what he does. And that's what he does for Job. I'm going to have to stop. So we'll stop there. We'll look at Job 11, 1 through 13, and look at everything he loses. This class is going to be a little longer than I anticipated. Sorry. I thought I was going to get done in about 6 lessons, but there's no way. I'm now on lesson number 3 next week, and that was my lesson 1. So it's probably going to stretch out a little bit. It's a great study though. And so next week we're going to look, we were going to start here with this next passage about what happened on another day on the earth. On another day on the earth after the one in heaven. And so we'll start there next week. So let me turn off the recording. Does anybody have anything they'd like to